Meatloaf did not die in some glamorous rock and roll cliché, face down in a hotel bathtub or wrapped around the steering wheel of a sports car. He died the way a lot of working men do, in a medical system of bright corridors and humming machines, after years of being told to slow down and years of finding new reasons not to. By the time the headlines rolled across phones in January 2022, the image most people carried of him was decades out of date. They did not see the old man shuffling between doctor's appointments, catching his breath at the top of a short flight of stairs. They saw the huge figure in the ruffled shirt and waistcoat, drenched in sweat, one hand gripping a microphone stand like a lance, while the other carved great arcs through the air as if he could rearrange the shape of the arena by force of will alone. Between those two bodies, the exhausted man on oxygen and the bat out of hell trapped forever in freeze frame on an album cover, lies the cruelty of his story. Marvin Leah Day grew up in a house where you learned very young that sound could hurt. As Meatloaf, he built a life on the idea that sound could heal, if you made it big enough and believed it hard enough. The problem was simple and impossible. The audience fell in love with the version of him that never turned down the volume. There was no knob on that persona that pointed to enough. Only the body underneath had one. He was born in Dallas, Texas in 1947 into a small world already cracked. His father, Orvis, had been a police officer and a World War II veteran before drifting into alcoholism and odd jobs. His mother, Wilma, taught school and sang in the church choir, trying to hold the shape of a respectable life around a man who regularly smashed it. For the child who would become Meatloaf, home was not a neutral place. It was a room where the air might stay calm or might explode, depending on how much his father had been drinking on the way back from work. Some of his earliest memories were of waiting for the key in the lock, waiting for the first slammed cupboard door, waiting for the tone of his father's voice to shift from joking into something darker. Dinner could be a normal family scene, meatloaf, potatoes, his mother asking polite questions about school, or a slow-motion disaster, plates clattering, accusations landing, Wilma's voice trying to intervene and being flattened. Marvin learned the survival tricks children always do in such houses: stay small, stay quiet, study the mood the way other kids studied their homework. On Sundays, the same man who had bellowed at everyone in the kitchen sometimes sat in a pew while Wilma stood before the choir. Marvin would watch his mother lift her hands, give a tiny nod, and bring 30 voices into the same chord. The same mouths that had spat insults the night before now formed vowels that matched. The noise was just as loud as a fight, but it was organized, harmonized, bearable. He did not have the language for it yet, but he understood something essential. Sound, when shaped, could control a room. Raw volume frightened people. Arranged volume could calm them, move them, even make them kinder for 3 minutes at a time. He retreated into that discovery like a bunker. When shouting started at home, he would hum hymns under his breath or replay in his head the big, swelling choruses he heard on the radio. Lying awake at night, pillow over his ears, he imagined different rooms, stages, theaters, spaces where lights were pointed at you on purpose and the people shouting were paying to be there. The fantasy was not really, "I want to be famous." It was simpler and more urgent. I want to be in a room where the noise is mine. The nickname that would become his stage name arrived long before the stage. He was a big kid, tall, heavy set, the sort of body other children notice from across a playground. At some point, depending on which version of the story he told, a coach or classmate looked him up and down and tossed off a joke. "You look like a meatloaf." It was not meant kindly. It was the kind of nickname that sticks because it hits all the insecurities at once. size, awkwardness, the feeling of being too much. For a while he flinched at it. Then, in a move that would define his entire career, he leaned in. If the world insisted he was too big, too loud, too much, he would become so big and loud that the insult turned into a brand. "I was never meant to be subtle," he would say later. It sounded like bravado. It was also a survival strategy. School gave him just enough distance from home to breathe. Choir and drama club gave him a vocabulary for the thing he had been doing in his head for years. On stage, the same traits that made him a target in hallways, the booming voice, the emotional overreaction, the way he seemed to feel everything 3 notches too strongly, suddenly made sense. Teachers who had watched him slump at the back of class lit up when he opened his mouth in rehearsal. In the harsh lighting of the auditorium, wrapped in someone else's costume, he discovered that there was a sanctioned way to be too much. Call it acting. In the choir loft, he learned how it felt when your voice merged into something larger than yourself. In school plays, he tasted the flip side, how it felt when all eyes focused on you alone. Both sensations were addictive. They suggested a world in which attention did not automatically precede danger. If the room was looking at you because you were singing the right note, not because someone had knocked over a chair, maybe being visible was not always a threat. His mother's death, while he was still young, ripped away the one person who had made that visibility feel safe. The church soloist who had taught him that music could sanctify a room was gone. What remained was a father sinking deeper into the bottle and a teenager who understood, at a level deeper than words, that staying in that house was a slow way of dying. Leaving became not a dream, but a deadline. He did not march straight from Dallas into a record deal. He stumbled, the way working-class kids without a safety net always do. There were abortive attempts at college, odd jobs, periods of sleeping on friends' couches. For a time, he worked as a parking lot attendant, watching other people arrive and leave in nicer cars than any he expected to own. He tried, briefly, to imagine a life where he clocked in, did as he was told, and clocked out again. An office, a shop, something ordinary. The vision withered as soon as he pictured the silence of those rooms. Whatever his flaws, he already knew this much. If he had to live the rest of his life under fluorescent lights, he would go insane. Instead, he kept gravitating toward the same kinds of buildings, theaters, clubs, rehearsal halls, the noise inside them. Even when it was bad, felt better than the quiet of an empty apartment. Los Angeles in the late 1960s and early 1970s was full of people trying to shout their way out of one life and into another. Marvin joined the cast of the musical Hair, then the Rocky Horror Show, learning what it meant to hit the same emotional marks, night after night, in front of different strangers. The roles were loud, messy, full of sex and politics and nonsense. For him, they were also classrooms. He watched how long you could stretch a note without losing breath. He watched which gestures read in the cheap seats and which didn't. He learned that if you committed past the point of dignity, some portion of the audience would come with you purely out of awe. It was in that liminal space between rock gig and stage play that he first crossed paths with Jim Steinman, a composer whose songs sounded like the internal monologue of a teenage goth angel being raised on Springsteen and Wagner. Steinman wrote in paragraphs, not slogans. His melodies climbed and crashed and doubled back on themselves. His lyrics treated the back seat of a car like a battlefield, a church and a therapist's office all at once. He had written songs too big for most singers to inhabit without looking foolish. Meat Loaf, the name now fixed. The man inside, still half Marvin, half invention, was one of the few willing to risk that foolishness. The partnership made no sense on paper and perfect sense in practice. Where the record business was trending toward tight radio-friendly singles, Steinman and Meatloaf were writing epics, 6, 8, 9 minutes long, full of spoken interludes and sudden gear shifts. Where other singers worried about cool restraint, Meatloaf specialized in sounding like a man arguing with God at 2 in the morning in a parking lot, tears streaming down his face, shirt stuck to his back. In the mid-1970s, they walked bat out of hell from label office to label office and watched executives' faces twist into the same wary shape. This is impressive, but what is it? Recorded with Todd Rundgren producing and members of the E Street Band helping out, Bat Out of Hell sounded like teenage feeling given an unlimited budget and no grown-up supervision. The title track opened with revving engines, horror movie piano, and a lyric about a motorcycle crash sung as if it were a revelation. I 2 out of 3 ain't bad twisted a barstool cliché into a devastating admission of emotional limitation. Paradise by the Dashboard Light turned a fumbling negotiation over sex and commitment into a multi-part opera, complete with a baseball play-by-play as metaphor for seduction. It was ridiculous and it was magnificent. It was not what anyone in a marketing department had asked for. For a long stretch, it looked like the demos might live and die as cult curiosities. Dozens of rejections piled up. They were told, repeatedly, to trim the songs, to tone down the drama, to make Meatloaf look more like the thin, androgynous frontmen dominating magazine covers. They refused. If the point was to offer an escape from gray lives, why would you offer it half strength? Eventually, a deal materialized. Eventually, the record was pressed. At first, nothing much happened. Then, in the slow, sideways way that some records change the world, the numbers started to grow. A Bat Out of Hell did not enter the charts with a triumphant fanfare and exit a few months later. It settled in. In country after country, it crept up and refused to come back down. In the United Kingdom, it would spend years lodged in the album charts. In Australia, it became a rite of passage. In working-class suburbs and small towns far from Hollywood, teenagers who had never been to a theater stood in bedrooms wallpapered with car posters and screamed along with this big man from Texas who sounded like he was willing to die just to get out of the driveway. By conservative estimates, the album would go on to sell tens of millions of copies worldwide. The exact figure is almost beside the point. What mattered was that it turned a man called Meatloaf into a permanent fixture in the mental landscape of people who had nothing else in common. For a whole generation, if you said over the top, they did not think of opera. They thought of that cover. The muscle-bound rider launching himself out of a grave on a bike, a bat the size of a church looming overhead, everything frozen at the moment of impossible escape. On stage, the escape looked even more implausible. Meatloaf did not stand at a microphone and nod appreciatively while his band did the work. He attacked the songs as if they had offended him personally. Night after night he ran, leaped, pointed, dropped to his knees. He treated every verse as if it were the climax of a 3-act play. Sweat flew, hair stuck to his face, shirts plastered themselves to his back. He played the love-struck teenager, the doomed biker, the pleading sinner, sometimes all in the same song. There was no wink to the audience, no hint that he thought any of this was silly. The only way it worked was to believe, absolutely, that feelings were this big. Success on that scale does not just change your bank balance, it changes the questions people ask you. Overnight, the boy from Dallas became the man journalists wanted to talk to about success. Excess, the American dream. But somewhere inside the roar, the old wiring remained. The kid who had learned to gauge his father's mood by listening still lived inside the man who now gauged audiences' moods by listening for the size of their applause. The same instinct that once told him when to duck and hide now told him when to push harder. If a crowd sounded restless, he didn't dial back and conserve energy. He doubled down. The touring cycle that followed Bat Out of Hell was brutal even by the standards of the 1970s. Weeks on end of travel, day after day of shows that treated every gig as if it were the last night on Earth. The songs were long and explosive. The sets were built around the expectation that he would leave pieces of himself on the stage. He obliged. Sleep suffered. His voice, repeatedly driven to the edge of its range, began at times to give way. The human body is not designed to live permanently at the level of a climactic note. Behind the scenes, another kind of strain was building. Contracts that had been signed in hunger now came due in a world flush with money and arguments about who deserved which slice. The partnership with Steinman, so organic in the rehearsal room, became complicated on paper. Lawsuits flew over ownership of songs, over the use of the Bat Out of Hell name, over royalties that seemed, to everyone involved, both enormous and mysteriously insufficient. Lawyers' offices replaced some of the studios on his calendar. Meetings about art gave way to meetings about percentages. Stress does not ask whether you are a rock star or a clerk. It simply shows up in the weakest part of your system. For Meat Loaf, that part was his voice. Early in the 1980s, as legal battles dragged and touring continued, he found himself on stages and in studios where notes he had hit without thinking now came only with effort, if at all. There were nights when he opened his mouth and discovered that the familiar roar had shrunk to a ragged rasp. In one studio session, he tried to sing the opening of a new song 3, 4, 5 times, each take thinner than the last, the control room growing quieter with every failed attempt. Doctors talked about nodules, strain, exhaustion. Some suggested the problem had as much to do with the mind as the throat. You cannot carry that much pressure around your neck without your body manifesting it somewhere. Imagine what that feels like when your entire identity rests on the assumption that you can, at any moment, fill a hall with sound. For a boy who had once escaped his father's shouting by retreating into internal music, losing the external one must have felt like a cosmic joke. The one thing that had always worked, sing louder, push harder, turn the feeling up until it bulldozed everything else, stopped working. He could not fix this with more force. Volume, for the first time in his life, was not the answer. The 1980s for Meat Loaf were not a glamorous downfall. They were something more banal and, in some ways, more frightening. The long stanodenum grinding plateau where a man tries to live up to a legend with a body that will not cooperate and a balance sheet that keeps flashing red. He released records that sold respectably but did not rewire the culture. He toured rooms smaller than the ones he had once sold out without trying. He stood in dressing rooms staring at himself in mirror bulbs that hummed, rehearsing the same gestures that had once felt like weapons and now felt, some nights, like borrowed armor. He gave interviews in which he swung between nostalgia, defiance, and a kind of lostness he rarely let sit on his face for more than a few seconds. Money troubles added a layer of humiliation. The public, seeing a man whose album had sold tens of millions, assumed he was rich beyond caring. Tax bills and bad deals told a different story. There were stories of debts to the IRS, of assets seized, of a star who had to keep working not just to feed his ego but to keep the lights on. Meetings with lawyers replaced some of the late-night hangs with musicians. He would sit at conference tables while people in suits explained clauses and penalties, and feel, for perhaps the first time since he was a child at his parents' table, like the least powerful person in the room. For a man who had always sold himself as the heroic escape artist, there was something particularly cruel in discovering that the trap he could not slip was made of paper. Contracts, judgments, obligations. If the story had ended there, big debut, messy middle fade out into cabaret, it would still have been a cautionary tale about scale and the way the music business eats its own. Instead, because his life seemed constitutionally unable to follow a modest arc. The third act arrived in the early 1990s. Jim Steinman came back into the picture with a new batch of songs that sounded, deliberately, as if the 1970s had never ended. While the rest of the industry traded in irony and grunge, Steinman offered Meat Loaf another chance to be sincerely apocalyptic. Bat Out of Hell 2, Back into Hell landed in 1993 like a phantom from another decade. The cover art echoed the first, the same bat, the same gothic theatrics, the same sense that subtlety had been set on fire. At its center was "I'd do anything for love, but I won't do that," a song that, on paper, should not have worked in that musical climate. It was long, it was bombastic. It had a title that sounded like a punchline and a melody that demanded you either roll your eyes or throw your arms out wide and sing along. Millions chose the latter. The video, a mini-movie in which Meat Loaf played a kind of rock and roll Phantom of the Opera racing through a rain-soaked mansion, introduced him to a whole new audience who had never stared at the original Bat cover on a bedroom wall. The song shot to #1 in multiple countries. He won a Grammy. Commentators who had written him off as a period piece were forced to admit that, at least for a moment, the world still had room for a man screaming his heart out over a piano line that sounded like the end of the world. For him, the comeback must have felt like vindication and déjà vu. Once again, the thing that saved him was the same oversized emotionalism that had caused half his problems. Once again, the reward for surviving the previous ordeal was not rest, but a bigger, more demanding version of the same job. Tours grew, sets lengthened, expectations, his own, the industry's, the fans, climbed. If he had secretly hoped that middle age might buy him the right to lower the volume and shrink the gestures, Bat 2 erased that hope. The machine had proof that the old formula still printed money. By now, his body was not the reckless 20-something engine it had been on the first ride. Years of touring, weight fluctuations, injuries, and the ordinary wear of time had taken their toll. Doctors told him about heart strain, about the risk of collapsing under stage lights instead of at home. He heard them. He acknowledged, in quieter interviews, that he feared not finishing shows more than he feared most other things. And then, night after night, he walked back into fog and spotlights and attempted to be the man people remembered. The collisions between myth and flesh became more visible. In 2003, he collapsed on stage at Wembley Arena, later undergoing heart surgery. Footage of him wobbling, grabbing for the microphone stand, then being helped from the stage ran on news broadcasts with a tone of shocked concern and, in some corners, morbid fascination. How fitting, some pieces implied, that the man who had sung so often about dying for love or passion or escape should come close to dying in the middle of delivering the line yet again. It was not a one-off. In subsequent years, there were more canceled shows, more public apologies, more moments when his voice gave out in front of cameras that did not flinch. Each one chipped away at the illusion of invincibility and underlined a more uncomfortable truth. When you have built your life on being too much, there is no graceful way to transition into being less. Actively choosing to scale back feels, to the audience and often to the artist, like betrayal. The culture around him shifted further. Rock's central place in mainstream charts eroded. The grand gestures that had made Bat Out of Hell feel like liberation came to feel, to some younger listeners, like camp. Meatloaf himself leaned into that sometimes, appearing in films and television shows that winked at his image, from Fight Club to guest spots on talk shows where the host introduced him with mock solemn reverence. He could be genuinely funny, undercutting his own seriousness with a self-deprecating aside about sweating through another shirt. But even when he joked, the core intensity never really drained away. Reality television, with its hunger for outsized personalities, welcomed him as both contestant and mentor. On Celebrity Apprentice and similar formats, viewers saw the same volatility that had made his best performances electric redirected into boardroom arguments and backstage meltdowns. Some found it uncomfortable. Others saw in it the logical extension of a life lived without a dimmer switch. He was still, even in a conference room, a man who did not know how to offer half a feeling. Health problems multiplied. There were further procedures, reports of chronic pain, admissions that he could no longer stand through entire concerts. In later tours, he performed some shows sitting down or leaning heavily on mic stands, the frantic physicality of earlier decades reduced by necessity. But the voice, when it came, still reached for the rafters. He did not reinvent himself as a gentle crooner. He attempted, as long as his lungs allowed, to deliver the same emotional payload in new physical packaging. Behind closed doors, doctors tried to translate risk into language an old showman would understand. They talked about percentages of heart function, lung capacity, the likelihood of another collapse being the one from which he did not get up. Friends recall him nodding, making a grim joke, promising to take it easier, and then looking at a calendar full of dates that represented not just performance opportunities but mortgage payments, college fees, livelihoods for crew members who depended on his tours. For a man who had grown up watching one parent fail to keep a roof over their heads, canceling work did not feel like self-care. It felt like dereliction, off stage, by the accounts of those close to him. He was often kinder, quieter, more anxious than his public image suggested. He fretted about the future of his family, about finances, about whether another tour was a good idea. He told interviewers he did not fear death so much as he feared losing the ability to perform. For a man whose earliest survival mechanism had been to escape into imaginary stages, the prospect of being stuck in a body that could no longer act out the escape must have been terrifying. When Jim Steinman died in 2021, one of the main mirrors in which Meatloaf saw himself went dark. The man who had written the songs that turned Marvin Gaye into the gargoyle angel on a motorcycle was suddenly no longer out there in the world, dreaming up new ways to set feelings on fire. Tributes flowed, full of phrases like larger than life and operatic vision. The same phrases that had followed Meatloaf around for decades. If you live long enough, you hear your own eulogies rehearsed at someone else's funeral. By the time the virus that would kill him came, his body was a map of every tour, every overextended note, every ignored warning. Official reports would tangle about the exact combination of factors. But the underlying reality was unmystical. His heart, his lungs, the machinery that had spent half a century pumping sound and adrenaline through his frame, could not keep going. When the news broke, fans posted clips from 1977 and 1993 as if the man in those grainy videos had been the one to die that week, not the 74-year-old who had been living quietly, mostly out of sight. Looked at from the right angle, his life is a parable about class as much as about art. Meatloaf was not a delicate poet dropping slim volumes into a refined marketplace. He was the son of a drunk ex-cop who turned his chest into a furnace so that people who had spent all week being small at work could feel enormous for an hour on Saturday night. Bat Out of Hell and its descendants were not written for gallery openings. They were written for car stereos, for factory parking lots, for bedrooms where kids taped posters to walls they did not own and promised themselves they would get out. That is why his tragedy lands differently than the familiar myth of the doomed rock star who dies at 27. He did not burn out early and leave behind a perfect, untarnished story. He worked and worked and worked and kept working long after his body began pleading for mercy. He sold a fantasy of limitless nights to people with alarm clocks set for 6 a.m., while his own days filled with doctor's appointments and legal paperwork. He offered to do anything for love in a world where the people listening mostly needed to do overtime. For the people who kept buying tickets, the bargain felt simple. You worked all week swallowing your anger at bosses, customers, supervisors. You drove home through traffic listening to news that made your blood boil. You worried about bills you could not quite pay. Then, maybe once a year, you went to an arena or a fairground or a casino showroom and watched a man in his 60s or 70s scream your secret feelings out loud under a sky of moving lights. You clapped. You sang. You went home hoarse and a little lighter. What you did not see, what the business model quietly depended on you not seeing, was the recovery time, the ice packs, the painkillers, the mornings when that same man sat on the edge of a hotel bed and had to steel himself just to stand up. There is a bleak kind of symmetry in that. As a kid, Marvin had no adult who could reliably step in between him and the storm in his own kitchen. As an adult, he spent decades stepping between crowds and their storms, using his body as a lightning rod. The music buffered other people's pain, turned it into something cathartic, singable. But electricity always leaves a mark on the conductor. By the end, his knees, his spine, his heart all told the same story. Whatever else Meatloaf was, camp icon, cult hero, punchline, legend, he was also, on the most basic level, a worker whose job description had quietly expanded from entertainer to sacrificial vessel, without any of the safeguards that title should have implied. Listen now to those songs with the whole arc in mind, and the melodrama sharpens into something like reportage. The bat that explodes out of the grave at the end of that motorcycle ramp is no longer just a teenage power fantasy. It is also the dream of a big, frightened kid in Dallas trying to get out of a kitchen where plates are flying. The lovers in Paradise by the Dashboard Light bargaining over sex and promises start to look like two people negotiating not just lust but the rest of their lives in a world that sells romance more easily than stability. The man in I'd Do Anything for Love who draws a mysterious line at that starts to resemble an artist who will risk his health, his voice, his future for the stage but cannot quite bring himself to do the one thing that might save him. Step away. There is a temptation, when talking about someone this excessive, to turn the whole thing into a joke or a fetish. To chuckle about the shirts, the hair, the sweat. To reduce him to a gif of a man in a fog of dry ice pounding his chest. There is an equal and opposite temptation to make him a martyr, a pure victim of a cruel business and crueler audiences. The truth sits, as it usually does, in the uncomfortable middle. He needed the roar almost as much as the roar needed him. He chose again and again to go back on stage when other people might have chosen to rest. The industry and the crowd chose, again and again, to pay him only when he went all the way. That is the knot his story ties around your throat if you sit with it long enough. What do we really ask of the people we turn into our escape valves? We say we love their honesty, their intensity, the way they leave everything on the stage. We say we value their humanity, but we buy tickets and records and t-shirts for the nights when they seem superhuman, and we turn away more often than not when they become simply old or tired or ill. We applaud the bat bursting out of hell. We scroll past the man being wheeled into hospital. Meatloaf spent a lifetime proving that feelings could be as big and messy as they felt inside your chest and still be worth shouting about. He also spent a lifetime paying for that proof with a body that could never quite keep up with the legend it was strapped to. If you only love an artist when they are screaming at full volume, what exactly are you loving, the person, or the noise they make for you? And when that noise finally stops, as it did for Marvin Lee a day in a world of white walls and soft beeping monitors far from any arena, another question remains hanging in the air he can no longer fill. After decades of demanding that he give us more, louder, higher, did we ever really learn how to listen to him when he was small?